Good evening, everybody. So hi, yes, my name is Ellie. Our lovely panel today includes Emma, Natalie, Hannah, and Matt, all immersive and site-specific stage managers, company managers. I'm sure you've seen from all of the sort of promo we did, but just some highlights. Emma has done a show in the back of an ambulance, so we can hopefully hear some good stories about that. Natalie has done secret cinema, Stranger Things, and she is currently in New Zealand, which is very early for her. Matt has done secret cinema, Casino Royale, and The Passion of Port Talbot. And Hannah has done the Lema's 25th concert and Buckingham Palace. I'm going to let you guys also introduce yourselves a bit more in person. If you just tell us a bit about yourselves, how you got into stage management, and what immersive and site-specific productions you've worked on besides the ones I've kind of just mentioned. So Emma, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Emma. I've been a stage manager for about 10 years, I think now. And I got into it after working at the Edinburgh Fringe. So I haven't trained or anything, but I've sort of worked after doing the Fringe. In terms of site-specific stuff, I've done a few bits and pieces. Obviously, the show in the back of an ambulance is a fun one. And there was another one by that company, which is Curious Directive, which is called Kindness of Strangers. Their other one was Return to the Silence. And then I did the Twits immersive dining experience, which was at the Vaults in Waterloo in London. So that was a big immersive event.
Fabulous, thank you. Natalie, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi. Currently in New Zealand. I'm from New Zealand, and when everything hit, I kind of came back home for a bit, and it's worked out quite well. I'm a freelance deputy stage manager and show caller. I've kind of done everything from theatre, operas, musicals, dance, events, festivals. So when the opportunity came up to do secret cinema, I was like, well, that's just another thing ticked off the list. So I worked on Stranger Things with them, which was their first foray into television as opposed to film, which kind of brought with it its own unique challenges. And then here in New Zealand, I've been lucky enough to do quite a few site-specific productions this year and last year. I just finished one which was led by two wheelchair users, and it explored the accessible forest paths that we have here in New Zealand, which was a really special experience.
Amazing, thank you. Hannah, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Sorry, just dealing with the mute unmute thing. So I'm a company manager. I mostly work in commercial musical theatre, to be honest with you. I've spent, I'm going to say 30 some years working in the West End, and occasionally I fall out of the West End and into something completely different. And I fell out of the West End a few years ago into the world of Punch Drunk, which was mental, and did The Drowned Man until it nearly killed us all. But that was one of the most incredible experiences I've ever had. And from there, I really got into the whole immersive and site-specific world, and did those concerts that you mentioned. And I also did the weirdest Christmas show I've ever done, which was essentially a grotto in a forest in Ascot with 14 Father Christmases. There's plenty of stories there. And then I fell out of immersive and site-specific back into the embracing arms of the West End until last March, of course.
Amazing. I'm very excited to hear about the 14 Father Christmases. And last but not least, Matt, could you please introduce yourself?
Evening, everyone. So I'm Matt. At the moment, I'm company managing, but I started off in theatre when I was 16 at the RSC. So that was quite a few decades ago, but did a fair bit of sort of traditional theatre before falling in with National Theatre Wales, who it's their main thing is to do site-specific theatre. So I ended up doing The Passion of Port Talbot, which got mentioned earlier, which was the big Easter production over 3 days that Michael Sheen was one of the co-directors and sort of star of. That's a production that I'll more than happily answer lots of questions about, and I can talk about it for days because I've literally done lectures on it that last a day. But it pretty much started with a flotilla of boats landing on Port Talbot Beach in South Wales, first thing about 5 o'clock on a Friday morning, and we took over the entire town for the rest of the 3-day Easter weekend, which literally was the entire town, going up to the mountains, football stadium in Swansea we took Michael to. So that was pretty mental, with about 1,000 community performers as well as a core professional cast. So that was the big headline site specific, but there's been plenty of other productions with National Theatre Wales that have been in maybe indoor spaces that just needed a lot of things putting in. We were in a converted aircraft hangar at RAF St Athan, which was sort of a disused part of the airbase, where we turned that into a performance space. We've been in restaurants, all sorts of random places. Had the pleasure of working in lovely castles as well for other theatre companies, where we sort of build stages in and amongst the ramparts, and having to put some nice lighting rigs in different places on battlements to make that work. And then, as also mentioned, have worked for Secret Cinema. I was company manager on Casino Royale, that was their London production a couple of years ago. And then I was production stage manager when we took it out to Shanghai, which was Secret Cinema's first international show. So I was there to get it up and running, working with the local Chinese team. And now I'm twiddling my thumbs just for another couple of weeks, and I'm starting with Immersive London soon on their Doctor Who Time Fracture production, which is going to be in central London. So which is a new company for me. There's quite a few Secret Cinema creatives and a couple of production people involved with that, but it's a very new company for me. So I'm looking forward to a bit of a difference, I should say, coming up soon. And the nice bit is I've managed to work in events, outdoor large scale events, production managing, and I had a sort of few year stints in TV where I worked on Doctor Who. So it's quite a nice combination of that with site specific in a building that wasn't designed for it, completely immersive, and I get to play with some of the props that I made a long time ago.
Amazing, thank you. Well, I think that is our panel, everyone. I think we should probably start with the most basic question, just for those who maybe don't have a clue why they are here, which is, how would you define immersive theatre and site-specific theatre? And in your experiences, what has been the biggest difference from that and traditional theatre? I think, Hannah, would you like to start us off?
On mute. The question, so what is the difference between immersive and site specific? Is that
yeah,
gosh,
or just defining what is immersive and site specific?
In my experience, I mean, compared to Matt, Matt's probably far better to answer this question than me. My experience of immersive is the audience and the stage are the same thing. In the Punch Drunk show that I did, our set was 4 floors of a building with 120 rooms, and the only way you could tell the difference between the cast and the audience and the crew was what colour mask they were or weren't wearing. And the site was a free-for-all, and in that respect, immersive was, you are, as an audience member, you're completely immersed in the world around you, literally as well as figuratively. Site specific, I guess, is, you're not in a theatre, you're in somewhere very specific that you can only do the show there. That's probably a fairly basic answer to the question, but probably missed a few things.
No, that's amazing. I think if we go into how would we define site specific, it is very much, not in a theatre space. And this is where I like to go to Emma and her ambulance story, just because if there's anywhere that's not a theatre, it is the back of an ambulance.
Yeah, so definitely not a theatre. So it was a show produced by Curious Directive Theatre Company, and it was ridiculously, it was even a touring show. So it performed in, I think it was 4 locations around the country, and it took 4 audience members at a time. There was projection and 1 actor in the back of an ambulance that would then drive around the town or city that we were in and would stop at half a dozen different locations, at which point the doors would be opened and there would be a scene at that location that fed into the story. And then obviously when there was travel in between the locations, there was either projection, which contributed to the storyline, or the actor who was in the ambulance with them, like, continued the story. I think actually there were 2 ambulances as part of it, because there was one scene where you saw an ambulance from the ambulance, and then there was a driver and an operator and me in the front of the ambulance. So I was essentially calling the show. We had everything on QLab and stuff with cameras in the back, doing several, because obviously it was only 4 audience members at the time. So it was kind of like a lot of the immersive things. It was a lot of rounds of it, doing it again and again with different groups of people. But yeah, we didn't set foot in anything like a theatre for the whole thing. And it was a lot of it outdoor, in fact, all of it outdoor, I think. So obviously very weather dependent. And yeah, it was definitely had its challenges, but it was really good fun to do something so very different from being in a conventional theatre. So that was really great.
I mean, I think that's as far from conventional as one person could get. And if we go into more of the immersive side, Natalie and Matt, you've obviously both done the different types of secret cinema. I don't know if either of you wants to take on how that differs from traditional theatre.
Right, how about I saw a finger point? So, I mean, for me, I saw Stranger Things, but I wasn't part of it. So Natalie will have to correct me on some bits. But certainly, in terms of communication systems and being able to set up props tables, those things that you expect to see in traditional theatre are there. The big differences can be whereabouts they are and whether you need multiples of them and maybe multiple backup systems. But a lot of it will be quite familiar in terms of the way that you would go about trying to prep the production and running it. What isn't necessarily quite so easy to work out is where props might go if an actor forgets to put them down on a props table, because they don't necessarily come off the wings, either with an ASM to greet them to be able to hand over a prop, or to go back to their dressing room and pass a props table. So there are a few things like that where you have to try and think ahead and try and plan for a few things that happen when people are caught up in a moment, perhaps. I suppose the other big thing is that it's been alluded to that the whole space, because it is immersive, you want everything as possible to be as hidden as you possibly can. Whereas fine in a traditional theatre, you know your sight lines, and you can put marks down and work out where different bits of backstage trickery, whether it's props tables or the mechanics of some sort of an effect or stage operation, you can very easily control what an audience sees. In immersive, you can't. So you either have to be very good at hiding things in props and really hope that the audience don't go rummaging in some of those sort of set dressing props, or you then add in more and more things to stage management tracks to make sure that you can get things to actors if they are stuck in that immersive world. So you might have a script and know that at a certain point or a certain time, an awful lot of immersive in terms of large scale is done with time coding, as well as sort of local trigger buttons that can either be done by technicians or stage management. But you need to be able to be quite adaptable. So if you know that an actor needs a certain prop because there is a very theatrical set moment about to happen, and they haven't been able to get there because there's been some audience that have really got sucked into the scene previous, then you have to try and be able to almost become an actor yourself and work out how you can slip something to an actor just before they need it without drawing attention to it. But a lot of the skills are what you will come up with and deal with in ordinary theatre as well. It's just trying to be a little bit flexible when things don't go exactly to a script.
I think that perfectly sort of goes on to my next question of the structure of rehearsals. And we just got a question about, so the legality of having an ambulance in a production. How did those sort of rehearsals go with a touring ambulance, and what were the legal actions in having an ambulance? Obviously that is an emergency vehicle.
It is an emergency vehicle, however you can buy them on eBay. So
amazing.
You obviously you can have a private ambulance. Literally anything can be an ambulance. You can't market it as an NHS ambulance, but any company can have a private ambulance because that's just how they work. So anything can be labeled up. And yeah, there's a lot of them on eBay. We had a beautiful one that was actually from, I think it was the 1970s. It was a really old school ambulance, and they come with some cool number plates as well. They've usually got like 999 on the number plates and stuff. I think that one actually went to a museum when we were done. And probably in terms of rehearsing for us, it was easier than it would be for, say, the Secret Cinema, because actually our playing space was tiny, because we just, you know, it was marking out the inside of an ambulance for when you're inside it, for the actor that was performing inside. And then obviously because our sort of proscenium arch, as it was, the doors of the ambulance were quite narrow, so the playing space outside the ambulance was also quite small. So although rehearsals happened in a regular studio, it was easy to then just transpose that to where it was, because a lot of our locations were as if it was just an ambulance driving around. We had a scene in a graveyard. When we were in Watford, we had scenes just sort of in a cul-de-sac, just sort of pulling into a cul-de-sac and things like that. And obviously there was a lot of work done with the councils and stuff to get permission to use the areas, but because we weren't modifying them in any way, everything was just portable props. We had one actor that was in several of the scenes who would just cycle between the locations. So yeah, it was actually, although it was such a very site-specific thing, it was a very small scale one compared to obviously some of the shows like the Secret Cinema. So yeah, it's probably a very different way of approaching rehearsals than trying to do it with hundreds of cast and stuff, because it was literally a cast of about 3 or 4. So it was in many respects probably much easier even than doing a straightforward theatre show, but just thinking about things in a slightly different way.
No, definitely. I think that makes actually a lot more sense. I think going on to the bigger shows and bigger rehearsals, Hannah, obviously you've done big concerts and the Buckingham Palace and Les Mis. How were those for rehearsals? How did they compare to, you know, traditional? Then, like Emma said, having those sort of smaller spaces that slightly make it easier, but having so many members to deal with. How was that?
The Les Mis concert, we had 3 different companies involved. We had the touring Les Mis company, we had the West End Les Mis company, and we had the alumni and principals company, which rehearsed at the O2. They built a tent for us in their sort of dock area. It was the only space we could find that was big enough, and we had a children's chorus as well. So we had 4 different rehearsal companies that only came together the day before the show, to be honest with you, because that was the only day that we could get the stage in for various reasons that are far too complicated to even remember now, because it's such a long time ago. But I think there was some sort of double booking issue, and we were between Aerosmith and the National Baseball something or other, and the NBA needed 3 days to fit up because of their floor that they had to put down to all the TV cables, and Aerosmith were playing on the Friday night. So in theory, the O2 needed us to not be there on the Saturday and Sunday, which was when we were doing our shows. So we had to do Aerosmith was Thursday night. So we put the set in on the Friday, Thursday, overnight Thursday, teched it and dressed it on the Friday, did a get out, took it to a studio. I think we went to, I can't remember, Negus or something like that, to do a lighting rehearsal. NBA put the floor down. We carried on rehearsing with the 3 different companies in 3 different venues. And then we came back in on the Saturday once NBA put their floor down. We did another fit up, put the set in, put the lighting in, worked overnight on the Saturday, did 2 shows on Sunday, and then we were out within 3 hours on the Sunday night, so that NBA could continue to put their floor down for their games on the Monday, which was a hell of a schedule, to be honest with you.
I was going to say, how many people would that sort of include? Do you know if there was a rough number, if it was hundreds, if it was?
I honestly don't know. We had 300 children in a chorus somewhere.
Oh, wow. Okay.
We had an alumni chorus of, I don't know, a couple of hundred. And then we had 3 different performing companies. Yeah, there's a lot of people. I think even the O2 was struggling to find spaces for us. At one point, we set up dressing rooms in a condemned nightclub. Just to find spaces to put people in, really.
Big crowds then.
There were a lot of people. Yeah, so we just had 3 different companies, and rehearsed in every single crevice and corner that we could fit people into. And to be honest with you, most of the rehearsing was done in situ once we got everyone together on site with the setup, because we just couldn't do it. We just couldn't find anywhere big enough to put a markup down.
Okay, also, could you explain, sorry, to people who may not know what situ means?
Oh, in situ, we just rehearsed on stage, really. We had a rehearsal room, which was a tent that they put up for us, sort of in the dock at the O2, which was where we'd had 2 weeks rehearsals for alumni and principals. So we did that in the rehearsal tent, but actually putting the show together, we did in the few hours that we had with the set and the lighting in place in the O2, because that was the only space we could find that was the right size.
No, I mean, that sounds very intense. That's quite a difference from sort of 4 audience members to God knows how many.
There were a lot of people. I don't think it's as big as the Talbot show that Matt did. I mean, that's epic. That's the size of a village. But we definitely had a lot. There were more hundreds than I can remember people involved in the concert. We had so many teams of people looking after so many teams of people. You just had to sort of get your head down and focus on the bit that you were looking after, because it was mind melting otherwise.
I think that goes quite well into sort of Matt answering this question. Obviously, the Passion of Port Talbot was huge. It was a whole village, like you said. So rehearsals for that, I mean, how would you coordinate that many people, and also that many people who aren't necessarily actors that are, paid professionals? How sort of chaotic was that experience?
I mean, I'd like to say professionally, not chaotic at all. It was very difficult. Luckily, a lot of the community groups, there were some members of the community that we adopted as performers that played a role all the way through the weekend. So we could work with them across multiple rehearsals, multiple spaces, and they really got to grips with a character that didn't necessarily have to do anything overly complicated in themselves. It might have been an armed police officer. Let's say we had the local rugby team that were dressed in sort of SWAT type gear. So what they had to do was really look tough, but they got to be involved with lots of things. There are other groups that then had their own specific performances within a performance that either, like a lot of immersive, it repeats, and they stayed in one place repeating. There were some places where they had maybe a song with a little bit of choreography that they did in multiple places, but it was the same content. It's just the fact that we moved it around. So there was a whole variety of community type interactions. But at least with those, it meant that quite often you could set them a task and they would meet up 2 evenings a week, let's say. So they started months before the core rehearsal of the professional actors started, because they were giving up 1 evening a week or 2 evenings a week close to the time to get that sorted. So in terms of stage management, we had the traditional 3-person stage management team with me as CSM. And then we had some what we called community stage managers who were professionals, but they were there going to the different groups in the evening. So although a lot of their work was a couple of hours in the evening, it was each day of the week, and then they'd spend a couple of hours in the afternoon typing up the stuff from before. So that was quite easy to get their content together. All of the main company rehearsals were done in a reasonably traditional way, not in a traditional space. We managed to take over some sort of working men's clubs and different sort of community village halls, things like that. So we were doing lots of scene work that we knew would be the moments happening at particular time on the clock, and then they spent a lot of time working out their characters. So when they were traveling across the town, then they knew what they were going to be talking about, or trying to interact with members of the public and draw things out. So there's quite a lot of character work that wasn't just script. There were some big moments, like the Last Supper that was happening in a particular working men's club, and it was supposed to have a secret gig by the Manic Street Preachers that Michael Sheen decided to announce on national radio about 3 days before it happened. So we had to then put in an awful lot more production and security to be able to deal with the extra thousands of, literally thousands of audience members that decided to descend on Port Talbot. But there were spaces where you could go, okay, we know roughly what the scene is going to be. We've done it in a different space. We might have one evening or nighttime rehearsal where it was trying to cram in your technical rehearsal and dress in one, but still missing part of your act because the Manic Street Preachers were only available for one night. In reality, there are quite a few of us that also work in events and do music gigs occasionally. So you know with their production team that actually bands rocking up onto a stage when you've got the tech rider and all the backline equipment is put in, it's not actually that scary, really. It's just making sure that stage management wise you had someone in place that was really strong to be able to shove them on stage and not be scared that you're shoving on somebody like the Manic Street Preachers, who are usually just quite rock and roll and they'll do things at their own pace. So it was knowing how to deal with people with different expectations. A lot of the audience, a lot of the community members hadn't done any theatre or performance at all. So for them, it wasn't quite rabbit in headlights. Some of them were, but on the whole, it was a case of, I don't know what to expect. So you really had to guide them through everything, which was absolutely fine, because then you were in a great place to make sure that you were getting what you needed from them, but they were still enjoying it. You just had to make sure that it wasn't a clock watch. Okay, the Ecti rule book says that we're supposed to be breaking now or doing things differently. It's a case of actually, if they want to carry on, then great, they're being swept away and managed to get things together.
I think that's probably like that community of, deer in headlights. You don't know how someone's going to react. And I think this kind of takes me very smoothly onto Natalie. I'm very interested in the Secret Cinema, having an audience come in that you don't know how they're going to react, but you hope that they are immersed and they're fully involved in the production, but also containing that so it's not sort of out of control. How was that when you're rehearsing with something that is so unprecedented?
Yeah, I think similarly to Matt and Hannah, it's very much like you bring with you your own kind of like metaphorical toolkit, I guess, of the shows you've worked on previously. It can be quite daunting. I hadn't done full big immersive like this before, but I had done very like new works and I had done devised shows, and so you've got those like base skills that you can bring with you. And in terms of Secret Cinema, it's such like, this is their bread and butter, and it's such a machine in the way that they like create their worlds, and they're so thorough with their world building that they like the audience is the core of that. So a lot of that work is done beforehand by the creative directors, and they've got this plan of where they want the audience to kind of eventually end up, allowing for various adventures along the way. But there's a really strong plan of the journey that they want the audience to take, and they create audience tracks as well. So on Secret Cinema Stranger Things, we had 6 audience tracks that like general admission tickets would get you, and you could pick your track based on which which decade of costume you wanted to wear or you wanted to be. So that really narrowed down the journey, so we could just focus on these 6 tracks that audience members would go on, and then each cast member would kind of align themselves with one of those tracks, and it would be a slightly different experience, but it just kind of demystified the experience. Instead of having 1,200 audience members turn up every night and it just being this huge unknown beast, you knew that there were, okay, well, we've got our 80s kids and our 70s kids, and we know where that section of the audience is going to be at what time roughly, obviously allowing for the unpredictability of that kind of live environment. And with Secret Cinema, it's also an experience, so you've got 1,200 people buying alcohol and eating food and doing all of those things that you don't usually have in a traditional sit down theater environment. So the security aspect of that also comes in as well. But I felt really held by Secret Cinema in that they had created this beautiful world before we even got into the rehearsal room. So you were really just executing this really well-designed plan, and it really did break down the process and go, oh, this is actually manageable, because it's not just this wild free-for-all. There's actually a huge structure to it that I think when you're an audience member in it, you might not realize how much you're being directed and how well thought through your journey is. But there is this whole team of people, and there's been this whole kind of rehearsal process to kind of make that really seamless. So yeah, I think it's really really useful, kind of that being kind of my first big experience in immersive, was being so well guided and well prepared by producers who knew exactly what they were doing.
Amazing, thank you.
So from the rehearsal period, moving on to when we're in the space doing our show, we'd love to know how the idea of backstage changes. So as Matt mentioned earlier, in a traditional theatre, you have your props table, and then you have your communication system and your comms. And this ties into an audience member's question about communications backstage. If you're in a site-specific show, how do the communications work? You don't have nice hardwired ports in the wall to put your cans in. And I'd like to start with Natalie. You recently did a show in the Ranges, in a walk around immersive one. How did the communication work with that? How did backstage work in that show?
Yeah, that was very analog, that show, because we were in there's forest ranges called the Waitakere Ranges in Auckland, and it is literally, you don't have cell phone reception out there, so it was incredibly analog, and we essentially just had to create kind of hand signals and a communication within our team that we could decipher, because we were also taking wheelchair users into the forest, and with that comes, I think, added kind of health and safety risks, and we essentially just had to make sure the entire team were first aid trained and had their valid certificates, and we would put our team in brightly coloured t-shirts at either end of the kind of walk that we were going on, and make sure that there were two team members together, so if there was ever an issue, there were two people solving that problem together. But in terms of being able to communicate from the head of the pack to the back of the pack, it was really not possible. So we essentially had to brief our audience members on kind of health and safety beforehand, and really create this sense of responsibility and community within the people who were going on that walk and wheelchair roll together. So they eventually took on this ownership of communication and passing information back and forth between us. So yeah, it definitely wasn't, in contrast to Secret Cinema, where we had comms and radios, and there was an ability to communicate with absolutely anyone in the space, even though your crew was huge and the space was huge. You had that system set up to really be able to touch base with whoever you needed to. This was complete opposite, and it was a lot of trust in the people who were choosing to go in that immersive and site-specific adventure. So it was a really different world, but I think it was very life affirming, and put a lot of faith back into humanity, how everyone really banded together and took that responsibility on.
Fabulous, thank you. And I'd love to open that question up to Emma, Matt and Hannah as well, about how your communications worked and the idea of backstage did in any of your productions.
I mean, on the ones I've done, I've been very lucky that we have had the digital tools to communicate. So when we were in the vaults doing the Twits dining experience, predominantly between the stage management department, at least, we had wireless comms. The vaults, if anyone has been, is its own weird and wonderful world. There's no phone signal down there because it's literally the railway arches under Waterloo. So if the comms went down, you are quite limited. And we also had the fun on the Twits, because it was a dining experience. The primary part of it was that the audience members were having dinner. So we were also working with a kitchen who were not on any kind of radio. So in that sense, it became, like Natalie was saying, very analog, very much running backwards and forwards. We ran it on a sort of a time code, but instead of it being a computer one, the time code was essentially me with a clipboard. So it was ran literally minute by minute, but you can't always run a kitchen quite that precisely. So it was a lot of running backwards and forwards. There was also waiting staff who were very helpful as we got into the run of it. They kind of learned what it was that we needed and where we needed people to be. We'd have overlapping audiences. So again, it was just kind of the thing, we were in costume for it as well. So we were able to kind of come up with some little signals and stuff, because obviously not all of the waiting staff had radios and things on them, but between us, we could kind of in character almost have some signals and things to sort of pass messages between us to say, yeah, everyone's done this and done that and in the right place and stuff. But yeah, obviously for a lot of the major stuff there is radios and things. But again, that place is so strange that we were running often with at least 2 other shows somewhere in the space. So you couldn't guarantee that your radio frequency wouldn't be sort of jumped on by another show by mistake. So it's contingency. I think the main thing for all immersive and site specific stuff is to have contingency for everything. And I think the same goes for your communications and stuff. Just make sure you've got a plan for if it doesn't work, because chances are it won't.
I think the bit I can add to that is most of my shows, we've had systems that we could hire in, whether they're theatrical comms or radio, walkie-talkie style radios. We've hired a couple of sat phones on occasion when we know that people have been going out into the proper wilderness. That also means that you've got an SOS button. So usually it means that there's some form of GPS. So if something really goes wrong and you're not able to make a call, then there's a great big red button on them that you can hit, and at least that flashes up to someone in the production office that there's been an issue. The interesting thing that we had with Casino Royale, I don't know if it's the same with Stranger, is because you're dealing with an awful lot of traders and vendors, so food and drink, security teams, cleansing teams. There is an event control as well as stage management and company management. So you've got 2 sort of hierarchies in a way. You've got the performance control, which is stage management and company management. You have then got the overall responsibility for the site, which was a separate sort of event management team in there, what would be the equivalent to a silver or bronze control if anybody's done sort of like larger scale outdoor events. They had the budget on that to be able to afford a comm system that the Formula One teams tour around with them. You end up with vast banks of programmable, it's beautiful kit. If you ever get to have a play with it or get on an event, even if you don't get to really play with it, go and just see if you can ask how it works, because these bits, yeah, it's phenomenal what you can do with them. So you also have the communication where sometimes you can have direct, if you know that there's security in a particular area where an ASM might be looking after, then you know that everybody's on radio. The chances are you could switch to a different radio channel and speak direct. There were some things where if you knew it was going to affect a site-wide issue, then you would almost have to go into event mode and communicate with the site manager. And either it would be the stage manager or myself would then be backstage and be able to react the quickest in conjunction with them. So that's the other thing in terms of outside of the technology bit. Sometimes the routing can be a bit different because you've just got so many other departments that are involved working in the same space as you, but their first thing that they're thinking about isn't the performance content of the show. It's everything else that goes along with it.
Excellent, thank you. Hannah, do you have anything to add?
I was just thinking, really, the 2 immersive site-specific shows I've done have very, very similar operating system with, multi-channel comms. And I think what we've always ended up doing is just having, like the emergency channel, and you all stick to your own channels, and you cross to other channels if you need to speak to other departments. And if all hell breaks loose, then you just let people know which channel you need to go to, and maintain radio silence unless told otherwise. And that's the channel that your event manager or whoever is overseeing the whole shenanigans would be waiting on to, you know, for someone to say this is kicking off at, you know, over at this area or this location. That's how the two, you know, immersive site-specific events, in terms of comms, that's how we've always operated it, and it sounds very similar to what everyone else has dealt with. But again, we've been very lucky in those instances to have, you know, huge banks of comms, and certainly with the drowned man at Punch Drunk, we had, I don't know how many people were on comms, but we had, I think, 10 channels, and you know, you've got your front of house and your merch and your catering, and they've all got their own rings, and you cross over to them, talk to them if you need to, or deal with a time code issue on a different channel. It's just remembering which channel's which. That's the problem I always have.
Amazing. Thank you so much, guys. I think if we move on to our sort of second set of questions, which more goes into how has your job as a stage manager been different from working on immersive and site specific compared to theatre? Is there anything that you've really noticed is a massive difference, or is it sort of the same structure, just different space? I think I'm going to start opening up to Emma if you want to start first.
I guess a little bit of both, really, in terms of my experience. So I do a lot more smaller scale stuff than some of these guys. I'm not sort of West End or anything based. So my role on traditional shows is very much stage management as an umbrella term for everybody that's in that department, rather than the very specific roles that you get on some of the bigger performances. And I think some of that translates into my experience of the immersive and site specific shows as well, is that you kind of have to expect to take on a little bit more than perhaps, okay, I'm just this very specific role and this is what I would do. Although you still have a track and you still have jobs, because there's so much variation in what can happen, and because the audience is such an unknown factor, you do have to be kind of prepared to mix it up a bit, perhaps more than you would in a show where you know the very sort of limited things that might go wrong because you're on a stage and there's only so many things that can happen. Even at the moment, I'm working online in immersive shows / games, whatever you want to call them. But obviously the audience is still a big factor of that. And there's just occasionally where they just really throw you for a loop, and you kind of have to think outside the box to get back on track with the show that they're doing. And yeah, I think that's probably the main thing. But in terms of kind of the very basic skills, I think a lot of them, I would say, are very similar. You know, it's people management and time management, and those skills I would say are pretty much the same. But yeah, it's just being prepared for a bit more variety than perhaps a traditional show.
Amazing. Does anyone want to take on the question, Natalie?
Yeah, I think I can speak to it from a show caller point of view as well, which I think is quite different. I come from a very similar background with Emma. Like, I didn't train in this, and the New Zealand industry is quite small, so we don't have like the traditional kind of 3-person team on a lot of shows. Like, the default is that you are stage managing, which is the umbrella of anything that show needs to be put on, you do. So that was really my background of, like, you've just got to muck in and do it. And then moving to the UK 6 years ago, I really switched it up and focused on being a DSM and a show caller, which is so specific and so like detailed in its role, and you really don't really expect to go outside of that. But I'm so glad that I had that background in kind of that ethics of just like mucking in and going for it and problem solving as you need to, because in immersive world you really can't predict what will happen. So if you've got that attitude, I think it really helps stay sane in that environment. And particularly as a show caller, like, the skills that you have in traditional theatre really help you. But I had to make my first digital prompt copy. I'd never worked without a paper script before, so that was a huge learning curve. And I was lucky enough to be supported by Super Cinema, and I got to shadow the show caller on Casino Royale that Matt worked on, and that was a huge help, just to visualize how you could possibly call multiple stages at once, how you could create a digital prompt copy and call from time code as well as calling from these visual cues that happen in one section of one stage, and you're working across 7 spaces and coordinating that in a way that made sense. That was a huge learning curve, and I found show calling and immersive very, very, very different to show calling traditional theatre. Mostly in traditional theatre, your aim is a consistency across the show season and maintaining the standards set by the designers, and making sure that you hit every cue the same way every single night. You can't do that in immersive because you're dealing with, like in the secret cinema circumstance, you're dealing with 1,200 unknowns, and those are your audience members. And one night one of your actors' wristwatches might be 5 minutes slow, and that puts the whole track off. So you just have to react. And there was something that the show caller on Casino Royale told me that I really took with me into that, and that was just like, as long as you get the car and the fire, it's fine. Like as long as those big things happen, people aren't gonna pull you up on getting a lighting cue or a sound cue or something slightly off because you had to react. But as long as those show-stopping moments happen, then you've nailed it. So that really helped me in my attitude change going into immersive, as opposed to kind of detail orientated. It was just like, make sure everyone's safe and make sure the big wow moments happen.
I think that goes really sort of smoothly into the different roles. So like you said, you focused on show calling. Matt and Hannah, you've both done company management more so. Do you notice any differences with those? Company management is something that I know us in education, we don't get taught about until quite later. So it's all very new to all of us. Is there anything in particular that you've noticed as a difference from traditional to immersive?
I think that the skill sets are very similar, but what you have to try and do is temper people's expectations, maybe what their agent or what the casting process has been led them to believe, or perhaps there hasn't been any misleading at all, but perhaps expectation of what their backstage space will be like, which we all know even for a short amount of time, the space that a performer has got to relax in or get their heads together, go through lines, whatever it is they need to do, is an important one. And we all know that quite a lot of established theatres backstage spaces aren't gleaming, shall we say. But most site-specific and immersive events are happening in spaces that were never designed to be a theatre and never designed to hold 2 to 60 performers in. And you can do the best job you possibly ever can, but you know that there'll be some people that will first walk into that space, they'll walk around the set and they'll be wowed by it. You go, yes, that's the reaction they want. And then that first impression, obviously, then their cogs start whirring and they start thinking, actually, what's my life going to be like in the next few months in this space? And you don't necessarily end up with tons of specific issues because of that, but it changes people's mindset on what type of show that they're involved with. And therefore, there are some people that are very solid personalities in an established rehearsal room. So in Casino Royale, we did an awful lot of rehearsals in established theatrical rehearsal venues in London, in central town, which obviously has all the nice mod cons, very solid people who that's a familiar environment for them. As soon as you start then doing the rehearsals on site and they're in that sort of backstage space, then it's interesting how personalities can change somewhat, and you realize actually the vulnerabilities that we all know that quite a lot of performers are very good at containing, controlling at different points. They usually come out at some point in a production. They tend to all come out at the same time when they start moving on site. And it's a case of just making sure that everyone feels as supported as you would if you're any member of stage management team. I know there are actors that feel very comfortable going up to an ASM in the wings rather than going to a company manager's office, but it's just understanding that actually it is different and people react to it differently, even though the nuts and bolts are usually the same. What you find backstage has to be covered, whether it's in a building or in a site, because you need sanitary conditions and somewhere for them to get a tea or coffee, and a fridge to put lunch in, whatever. But yeah, it's strange how personalities can just have a wobble maybe and just need a bit of reassurance and settling in.
Amazing, thank you. Hannah, I was wondering if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, my experience is slightly different, but that's because I've just done different shows, and the two immersive shows I've done, I was lucky enough to work with companies who had been working with each. It was, gosh, it's hard to explain. The performers were used to working with that style of, they were punch drunk performers, or they'd been doing this grotto for years, so it wasn't like we were bringing in, West End hoofers to do something in a forest. They knew how the system already worked. So we were lucky enough to have performers who were not thrown by their environment at all. But what it did mean was that, the bulk of the additional and new responsibilities as a company manager for me was more about containing what they were trying to do, because they'd come in every night and go, I think I've come up with a new way of swinging off the ceiling. And I'd be going, oh my God, no, don't swing off the ceiling. That's a drencher pipe. So rather than just sort of saying, we'll stick to the blocking and, enter upstage and go across here and exit downstage and don't, go past number 5 or whatever. They were being super duper creative, and they were finding new ways to get out of Santa's kitchen, and they were finding new ways to get across to, the cinema and all sorts of bits that they'd come up with, because they were very much devised pieces, and performers were used to working in those environments. And my big deal with it really was trying to contain it and control it in the way that I'm more used to doing in a West End show, where it repeat. But my experience of these immersive site-specific shows was a more creative and dynamic background. So they were more used to throwing in the odd bit of development, and then us having to sort of yes or no, risk assess, find the props, change the show, work with what they were throwing at us. Which happened quite a lot. So that was, for me, that was the biggest difference between, the world that I'd come from, which was straightforward West End commercial shows where you do the same thing, to this whole devised and developed world where, they were very familiar and I really wasn't familiar with it at all. And for me, that was, payroll is payroll, scheduling is scheduling. People get hurt, you take them to hospital. But actually saying to someone, no, you can't do that because we haven't risk assessed it, or no, you can't do that because you'll be in the wrong place for the next loop if you do that, or we don't have the props for that yet. I know it seems like a good idea to hang off the ceiling, but could you not just yet until we've made it safe for you? Because they've got, they had this amount of creativity that was just pouring out of them that was very different to the world that I came from, where people were more, more controlled by the direction as opposed to the creativity.
Amazing, thank you, Hannah. And can we believe that we are halfway through our panel tonight? Good evening, welcome back everybody to our chance to ask immersive and site-specific stage managers. So if we can crack on to the next questions, Ellie, you can take it away from here.
Thank you, Emily. So welcome back, everyone. I think we're going to kick straight off with a very loaded question of, when working in immersive and site-specific, how do you tackle things going wrong with such an unexpected thing? Obviously, we've sort of touched on taking in the audience, knowing their tracks and where they're going to go, but not quite understanding, things could go a bit haywire sometimes. So I think I'm going to pass to Hannah first. How do you tackle when things go wrong?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask me first.
I'm so sorry.
As a company manager, I treat it like any show. It doesn't really matter whether you're in a normal theatre or back of an ambulance or a concert hall or a field, or if there's a problem, you need to get the problem. You need to figure out what to do and how to do it and who to do it with, in the way that you would treat any problem, really. Obviously, you need to take into consideration the demands of where you are and the problems that would bring you additionally. But I would just treat it in the same way that I treated a problem in any show.
So on the basis then of, treating it as you would any other show, does anyone have something that, when it did go wrong, it was kind of funny? Is there a story somewhere of something going slightly wrong and you look back and laugh now, but God, it was stressful at the time?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. When I was doing The Drowned Man, my only cue, as it were, as a company manager was looking after the premium entrance. I don't know if anyone saw The Drowned Man, but we had two different entrances. So standard tickets, you'd go in through the lift, but premium entrances, you had an additional scene, which was really quite spooky and ended up plunging the room into complete darkness, total blackout. And depending on whether we had any premium entry or not, sometimes we'd sit there for a loop with nothing to do, and there'd be me and 3 cast. And I had this beautiful little day glow torch because I had to, do some cues. And we'd started the loop and the music had started and we had no audience coming in. So we were all just sitting around the table, chatting away because we knew we didn't have any audience coming in. The lights went out, lights went totally to black. I was watching my torch across the room like this because I hadn't realised that it glowed in the dark. As the lights went up, I looked around and there were 30 Americans watching us. They'd come in through the wrong door and they saw me and the cast who were meant to be in that scene, which was meant to be terribly spooky, and clearly wasn't because we were sitting around the table with our feet up, playing with a day glow torch. And we just scattered. We just literally scattered. And I think one of the cast had the presence of mind to take them out of the exit that they'd come in through and show them the main entrance. That was when things go wrong and you don't deal with it.
That sounds amazing. Just slightly going, we'll just try that again.
Yeah.
I think, Emma, I'm really interested to hear from your point of view, obviously with the twits and the ambulance. Was there something that went wrong and you kind of just like, oh God?
The ambulance one, to be honest, from a stage management point of view, there was very little we could do because the main thing that would go wrong would just be traffic. But we were very lucky. The company are a devising company. All of their work is devised. So, and a lot of their performers work with them a lot. So they know how to devise pretty much on the spot. So they were very good at sort of just filling gaps and things. The twits, again, the vaults is so hard to explain to anybody that's never worked at the vaults. It's maybe slightly more understandable if you've been, but it's just the craziest place. And the twits, because of the nature of the show, the whole design was very dirty. We had a lot of like mud everywhere, and so everything felt fairly chaotic. The whole vibe was supposed to be very chaotic. So when there was real chaos on top, the atmosphere just would sometimes be insane, and at the time was quite overwhelming. We had one day, so there was a scene where one of the performers would fall backwards in a bathtub, and because he'd been poisoned. And then that was the end of that room. The audience would move out of that room and into the next room. But what happened on one of the days, he fell into the bathtub and managed to land at one end of it. So it kind of bounced up and went back down. And as it went down, it severed a cable. And we lost, it tripped the fuse box, but not just for that room, because the vaults is not necessarily wired like that. So we then, I think, obviously the audience were led out thinking that the blackout was part of it. That bit was fine, but we then had a mad scramble for the next 10 minutes before the next audience incoming to try and get lights back in that room. So while also trying to manage the food going into the room where they'd just gone, we were sat frantically sort of rewiring cables and things to try and get it up and running. And yeah, it was one of those crazy things that now it seems hilarious, but at the time it just felt insane, and just not one of those things if anyone had said to me, yeah, the bathtub is going to sever a cable, like, that's not going to happen, that's not a thing I need to prepare for. So yeah, there's always stories. I don't know anyone that's worked on an immersive show that doesn't have 100 stories. They're always great.
I'm currently noticing the link between darkness. It seems to be lights are our enemy in this.
I think it's because they're very often spaces that aren't designed to have theatre lights in. There's usually dampness involved. Like, I don't know about the others, but my experience of immersive theatre is very damp.
And
And
Natalie's nodding
like,
along like, yeah,
lights and
absolutely.
sound, they don't really get on with like water and mud quite so well, really. So
we had one problem with a piece of fruit that caused a lighting problem because it got someone who I will name, it was Kanye West, threw a lemon across the room in we had these little one-to-one scenes, so a member of the cast would take a member of the audience into these one-to-ones and do, you know, who knows what. And we had 3 days where the lighting wouldn't work properly in this one-to-one scene, and it took us 3 days to figure out that Kanye West had thrown an orange across the room, and it got stuck between the dimmer and the wall, so the dimmer wasn't working properly.
Oh my, lighting is, yeah, I'm calling it. Natalie, you've been nodding along.
Yeah.
I'm hoping you have.
I think like I would talk about secret cinema as like this really cool experience and everything like that, but I really don't want to give the wrong impression. I was still in the back of an air hangar with holes in the wall in December with tarpaulin over the lighting desk, not over us because we weren't as expensive, but over the lighting desk, because often when it rained it would leak in, and that was the most expensive thing. And we had, each of us had little heaters at our feet, and I had a blanket and a hot water bottle. So I just, yeah, cold, wet, damp is definitely my experience of immersive spaces. I want to also, like, especially as a show caller, you still have the same procedures as you would on like traditional theatre, where you talk through with the directors and your team of like what could go wrong and what contingencies you will make up for that. And then secret cinema as well have like a specific show stop or show pause and like evac of the space procedure, which is done in conjunction with that event management kind of arm of the production. So operations will communicate with stage management, and if we need to evacuate the space or cancel a performance or stop something, we will do that in conjunction with the event arm, because essentially they manage the audience and stage management will manage the performance side, so the cast. And we had to, in Stranger Things, we had to evacuate the space during a matinee performance, which was really full on, but it was wonderful to have that procedure in place, because especially as a show caller, I just went to that tab on my spreadsheet and I just read out my little script that I'd written and talked to the people that I needed to talk to and grab the radio and follow that procedure. We also had a show pause moment, which was when, as seems to be the way, one of our generators went down and half the lighting rig in our big performance space went down. And that was just a matter of safety as well, because we had cast walking and running along an elevated platform. So, but those decisions are never made solo. So, you know, I had my company manager next to me, my stage manager next to me, and we were talking. And with secret cinema as well, you often have an on-site production coordinator or a producer as well from the company on comms too. So you really do have that support when you're making those decisions. But ultimately, same as any show, if it affects the health and safety of the audience or your cast, then you work together to make sure that it's a safe environment. My announcements over the Gob mic were slightly adjusted to reflect the immersive nature. So it was a lot more like, howdy everyone, and talking to them as if you're in that immersive experience, which didn't convince many people with my New Zealand accent, but still trying your best as a show caller to make that situation as part of the world as you can.
I'm standing by. Lighting is apparently an immersive's worst nightmare. Matt, I'm guessing you've got a story somewhere that is just, oh God, things have gone wrong, and you're just looking back on it.
Yeah, there's so many, as Hannah said. Really, there's tons. I suppose the most fun one, though, that won't have any legal ramifications, I'll talk about Passion of Port Talbot. And really, I'd recommend, I think on YouTube you can still find them. The BBC did a 2-part documentary about it, and there was a feature film made alongside it. So if you want to have a look, then please do try and find it, because all of the preamble will be covered by those. But the culmination was Michael Sheen walking through the entirety of Port Talbot with a real heavy life-size crucifixion cross on his shoulders for, I think it was probably about three and a bit hours before he then reached a roundabout right on the seafront in Port Talbot, where we had a raised platform, rostra sort of disguised, and a huge, really huge crucifix that he would then get nailed to, and then that would pivot upright, and he would then be up there for about 20 minutes whilst we had a sort of a projection on water light show, sort of big culmination. So we knew, obviously, after 3.5 hours of him walking around with a genuinely heavy cross on his shoulders, we needed to assess and make sure that he was going to be safe to hang from this other cross for 20 minutes. So it was decided quite early on that I would be the person that would greet him. So I was in costume on this mound, and I would make the call whether he was really safe enough to do it, and if so, then I'd be the person that nailed him on the cross, and then everyone else came up and we put him upright. There's always that scene, you know, in the black and white movies where the villagers are chasing a baddie and there's pitchforks and flaming torches. There was a big, huge, long road that was sort of leading down towards this roundabout, and it was night time, and we thought, okay, we know, because of the international media interest that had built on this show in the couple of weeks previous, and then we'd had even more news teams fly in internationally for the 3 days of performance. We were expecting a lot of people there. When I got there from the previous sort of stage section that I'd been looking after, I couldn't actually get to the centre of the roundabout very easily. There were about 3,000 people already waiting at the roundabout, and we already knew that there were 5,000 people, because the police were counting them, that were following Michael in this procession coming down there. So we first of all had a case of, oh God, he won't be able to get to his own crucifixion because we've now got 3,000 people we weren't expecting surrounding this roundabout. Luckily, we had made good friends with the police, so they managed to help our own sort of security teams that we had hired in, and our rugby players who were dressed as police as well. So we managed to get him there. But it was a bit of a squeeze. We had some community drummers there doing sort of really sort of menacing, trying to build the tension up to this crucifixion moment. So we had to get them to pad a little bit. And Michael finally sort of comes to meet me at the back of this rostra. And he's obviously sweating, as you would be after carrying a cross for 3 hours. But he's really not in a good way. He's like, Matt, I just need to get under the stage. Got to get under the stage. I'm like, oh my God, I'm not going to be able to crucify Michael Sheen. How do you finish the Passion story without somebody being crucified and sacrificing themselves for all of mankind? So it's like, okay, screaming at the DSM on radios, which were poor quality, but of course, with all these drummers and everything, trying to hear wasn't the easiest, but it's just like, keep the drummers going, keep the drummers going. Managed to get Michael underneath the rostra that we'd built, just trying to work out what on earth was going on, how on earth we do this. Just like, what is the matter? Are you okay? What? Couldn't see any obvious wounds or anything. It looked okay. It was like, no, Matt, I really just needed a wee.
Amazing.
The one thing that we hadn't thought about in terms of technical backups, in terms of communication, in terms of if we had to run somewhere to keep it going, it's just the fact that Michael Sheen needed a wee before we could carry on. It's like, okay. So you just gave him his moment and we managed to carry on. So that was great, because after that moment of having an absolute heart attack on how on earth we finished this show that is being filmed by documentary teams, a feature film team, the world's news teams that have flown in especially for it and not knowing how to finish it. All I then had to do was talk to the DSM and the ASMs by the drum and say, can you just keep it going? Just get them to loop it for a few more minutes and we'll be right back with you.
No problems, just he needed the toilet.
Just needed a loop, but yeah, that's mine.
Well, I think that is, everyone loves a good sort of things go wrong moment. And it's always fun when you can look back at stuff like this and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. But I'm firmly standing by lighting Immersive's worst nightmare. And I think that is agreed upon everywhere. Sort of going into lighting, how does the relationship change between other departments and stage management when you're doing immersive and site specific? When we're doing more traditional theatre, it's, you know, their HODs, and we have our production meetings, and it's very, props do props, and we converse with them when they come and do our thing, especially with West End when you've got ASMs that aren't sourcing props. How does that relationship change? I think I'm going to open up to Emma to start off.
Again, I think it sort of depends on the scale of theatre that you're used to. Certainly in the smaller scale and fringe stuff, there's much more of an overlap between sort of within departments and stuff. So it's not necessarily just that ASM does props and this does, you may do a bit of everything. And I think the main thing I found from the immersive stuff that I've done is everyone works a lot harder to understand what the other teams are doing, so that when you do get the problems, maybe you can all help sort of contribute to solve it, and also that you understand why something might have gone wrong. So, on a big show like the things with generators, you understand that there's the risk that those generators might go down, and that will affect the lighting, and lighting also understands that you've got this many people to manage, and so actually having lights in certain places just isn't going to work because audience members touch things and stuff like that. So I think it's just a greater understanding of all the different departments, and perhaps a slightly more collaborative sort of thing with it. Certainly working in the vault on the twits, because it was sort of so damp and things, there was a lot of work going back and forward with lighting and sound, after previews, and going, well, actually this isn't working and this isn't lasting. And we had a lot of pyrotechnics in the show, which the little pyro pods, we had to set them so last minute, because if they were in the space for any length of time, they got too damp to fire. So it was kind of working with creative, so the directors and stuff, to figure out when we could set stuff and things like that. I think my experience certainly is it's maybe a little bit more collaborative, not just between the creatives themselves. So not maybe, because obviously, set designers and lighting designers often work very closely together, but maybe not quite so closely with things like stage management as they sort of do on an immersive thing, because it's much, much more, everyone needs to know a little bit more, I think, to make it work.
Definitely. I think I'm kind of going to pass on to Hannah, because I think you have the most knowledge for West End, in terms of, I think West End is, in my opinion, sort of the traditional one everyone knows. So that's kind of what I'm referencing from. In your opinion, how do those relationships change?
Gosh, that's a very good question. I think from a traditional, commercial West End background, you have one stage and you all work on one stage and you have to take your turn, and there's only so many hours in the day, and lighting can have this much time and sound can have this much time, and you can rehearse for this many hours, and it takes the crew this long to reset, and that's your framework. I found my experience of immersive theatre, which is really only a couple of shows and a couple of concerts, is that you're much more constrained by the space. Whereas, in traditional theatre, you have your stage and that's how it works. And, the director wants what he wants or she wants. And, you have a great, I can't think of the word. I think in my experience of immersive is because your space is so unusual, that's what takes precedence. Does that make sense?
Yes.
You can do anything you like, really, as long as it fits into the space. I'm finding this very hard to describe. I'm so sorry.
It's all right.
I think you have more freedom. I think that's probably what I'm driving at. I found that the shows that I've done immersively seem to have a lot more freedom about them. I think it takes the the black box away to a certain extent. You're less limited by overhead lighting and the fourth wall and the stage left, stage right exits. You've got a completely different dynamic in terms of space and daylight and sound and dampness, and whether you've got wood chip on the floor or whether you bring wood chip in or whether you plant a load of trees, or there seems to be there seems to be a greater freedom to experiment. And I think that gives something to people, to everyone, to all departments. And as you say, I think there's a lot more collaboration, because I think you have to collaborate more, because it's a very different environment. You know, we're all used to working in a theatre somewhere. We all know how it works and where the wardrobe department is, and you know what wigs do, and where the sound desk goes. But I think, you know, every single immersive space is completely different from the last one, and the amount of teamwork that goes into, all right, let's get this one right, I think is colossal. But I think that's got a lot to do with the fact that immersive theatre gives people more freedom.
I think a very interesting sort of point, because obviously us in educational settings, we sort of, our main focus is traditional. That's how they teach us. That is primarily what we do. I want to sort of open that up to Natalie or Matt, if you have anything to add on to that, just from your own experiences.
I think space-wise, you know, Hannah is correct in the fact that if you're in a big wide open space or a ruined castle or something like that, then you do have a lot more freedoms in terms of entrances and exits. But actually, what you then find is that everything costs a lot more to do. So your possibilities when you go and first visit a space can be absolutely vast. You will then soon find that you have to make decisions, and those get closed down because you just can't afford to do everything, and the show won't require to do everything either. So if it's a big open space, then sort of you would hope before rehearsals start, a lot of those decisions can be pared down a little bit. If you're in a show where it's quite remote and you're having to take everything in, if it's one of those spaces where it's outside other buildings and using their facilities, then actually it can be a lot more freeform, a bit like a flash mob style performance. Then actually you can do a lot of things very creatively, but perhaps a bit more structured performance, it gets pared down a bit quickly. But what you do end up doing, I suppose a lot of people's experience with working with electrical departments might be telephones or lamps, desk lamps, bits of dressing in traditional theatre, things where it's that fine line on who sources it and then who gets it working, or whether it needs a battery pack hiding somewhere, things like that. And in Site Specific and Immersive, you've got those things, but also there could be the simplest things like the production management and the designers will know that a set of queues has to be operated locally, so there will be a couple of remote buttons that links to a separate QLab desk, let's say, that an ASM might press. So they've got that planned, but actually then when you start rehearsing in the space, the ASM or whoever it is in the stage management department that's doing it then needs to work with the production electricians a lot more on how the cable routing works, which on the whole, in more traditional theatre, you don't have to have too much in terms of that established cable running type logistics, rather than the specific prop type thing and how that's going to work best. So I suppose that's the biggest. And I think also for things like secret cinema, where you have an absolute vast scale of site, but you are there for a long time, it's trying to make sure that everyone feels part of the same family, because it is very easy for Sparks and the sound team to make their own little world somewhere because they are used to having a control room, and then you hardly ever see them. So it's really important to make sure that just in terms of a theatre family, you're getting together, and it also means that you don't miss those things that they stop thinking about that could affect a performance. Certainly on Casino Royale, the lighting rig was so vast that if there was a power spike and you lost a lot of lanterns, the chances of them being able to replace all of those bulbs between a show or if we were having a matinee one day, then the chance of them just physically being able to get around the site and change everything and flash everything through wasn't going to happen. So it was a case of making sure that you then have the effect light sorted, and there's plenty of redundancy in those sort of vast spaces and lots of light that mean that people can walk around safely. So it's making sure that they are reminded of what is the priority quite often. And also when cast changes happen before COVID, obviously lots of people have injuries or illnesses or family things that come up. So there's quite a lot of re-rehearsal or polishing up of rehearsals. You might have had understudies that did all of their rehearsal beforehand. They've got it sorted, they've got it down on paper, and it's been 2 months since they've actually had to do it properly. So even if they've been walking around, being able to have a good amount of rapport, I should say, with the different technical departments to make sure that they'll get your extra rehearsals covered without groaning too much or costing you too many donuts is quite a good one to have.
I think that sort of comes on to the difference we have in our department. So Natalie, obviously you're primarily a show caller. How has it been in your experience having those departments work with you compared to other things you've done?
Yeah, I think a key difference, like particularly with Secret Cinema, is that there were essentially 4 creative directors involved. So you didn't just have to establish a relationship with one director. It was kind of trying to create a relationship with all 4, and then that relationship had to translate into like cohesive notes that wouldn't be just like between you and one person, but making sure that there was communication across the whole creative team. And when you're working in a space of the size and the vastness with Secret Cinema sets, often you have multiple lighting team members and sound team members and video and all of that. So just making sure that you can get in front of every single person and know who's giving you what information you need when. That was quite different to traditional theatre, where you're like, great, I know the names of the 3 people who are going to give me cue lists and who I need to work with to create these cues. But again, you're often working with professionals who live and breathe immersive, so they intrinsically understand. And it was just like a dream as a show caller to work with these designers who knew just inherently, like, oh, well, you won't be able to cue all of these things, so I'm just going to automate this for you, and here's this beautiful packaged little cue sheet that I can give you, and here are all the follow-ons, and this is where you need to be looking when. I found it, as everyone else said, like a hugely collaborative process, and really empowering in that as a show caller, my creativity was really valued. And oftentimes directors and designers would be asking like my opinion on how things should be cued together or designed in a way that would make it for like a really beautiful cueing sequence and would enhance the experience for everyone. And it just, yeah, it felt like a really collaborative and creative environment, despite the fact that you're often working with multiple creatives and a bunch of people who you usually wouldn't work with. It was a really challenging but exciting step as a DSM to really feel ownership of that cue sequence, so that when it came time to improvise or change things up during the season 2 months in, you still really had that connection to what the designers and directors wanted, so you were able to really make those calls confidently. And I think that's I really, because the tech process is traditionally a lot longer in immersive theatre, because you've got a lot more to tech, particularly Secret Cinema or Punch Drunk, where you've got all these multiple spaces and rooms and you're ticking them all kind of one by one. It feels really nice to kind of get into the season with that confidence of how that piece should be executed.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I believe we have some audience questions, which Emily is going to address.
Thank you everyone for submitting audience questions. We have a question here about accessibility and about whether immersive and site-specific theatre aids or hinders accessibility. Natalie, I know that you've recently done a piece about accessibility, and I don't know if you want to explain how that was incorporated into the show you did.
Yeah, totally. So my other hat at the moment, while we wait for kind of bigger shows to be happening here in New Zealand, is the accessibility and inclusion coordinator for the Auckland Arts Festival. So my kind of focus with the entire festival programming, which was 70+ performances, was making sure that each performance was accessible to various communities, whether that's deaf, hard of hearing, or blind, low vision, wheelchair users, neurodiverse, just trying to make accessibility and inclusion integrated into a festival program. I used a lot of my stage management experience in this role, because often in traditional theatre we have experience with audio description and touch tour and sign language or captioned performances. So that kind of gives you a really good insight into what kind of mainstream theatre is trying to achieve with accessibility. With the piece that I produced for the festival, which was led by 2 wheelchair users, it came out of an accessibility issue where this path in this forest was only just built. So before that, wheelchair users couldn't access public spaces and public natural spaces. So it was really a comment on how that's changed, but also that accessible path only goes up to a certain point, and then there's stairs, and then wheelchair users can't access the path beyond that. So I think it's been a real learning curve in how inaccessible spaces are. And when we assume that there's like, oh, that's a flat space, I guess a wheelchair user can use that, you don't necessarily think, yeah, but has like typically site specific and immersive environments are not accessible. Like site specific, there's no hearing loop in that space. You can't have a deaf or hard of hearing audience member in that space because it's site specific and it costs thousands of pounds to put a hearing loop in that space. So you're immediately cutting that away. It's not scripted and it's not in one space. So how do you caption that, and how do you have sign language in that space? How do you audio describe immersive performances? And it essentially comes down to money as well. Can you afford to have a wheelchair accessible built-in backstage area in a found space? So I think it's a huge barrier in my own experience with that. So I think, yeah, it's got a long way to go. And I think in my own experience, site specific and immersive is really not accessible friendly spaces.
Can I add, because I know you mentioned about the hearing loops. There were things that we did in National Theatre Wales that, I mean, you're right, there is cost of kit and access, maybe paths and routes in some spaces that are quite challenging, but we sometimes often found a way of making at least one area have a loop, for instance, rather than a whole space. In those productions where budget was tight, it meant that we had to have maybe a relay camera or something for some spaces where they just wouldn't be able to physically visit, or if there were people with access, physical access needs, then there was some other sort of relay. So there was some way of them witnessing those bits of the performance that they wouldn't otherwise. Now, obviously, that isn't the same as being able to experience it as in the flesh, but the fact that you knew that actually it wasn't that far away and there was something there, the audience members that we had were appreciative of that. I know there's obviously more that can be done, and the price of kit needs to come down a lot more as more people use it, so you can do even more and get more people to see it. I guess the good thing with site specific is that hopefully the idea is that you're taking productions to people and places that otherwise wouldn't get to see them. And that was one huge thing with National Theatre Wales when they first started, was making sure that people all across the country of Wales could access theatre that they were interested in. So taking it to those spaces meant that hopefully people could get there, where actually disabled minibus hire or something would mean that they wouldn't be able to get down to Cardiff or Swansea or places like that. So there were swings and roundabouts. Still a lot to be done, but I think it was certainly getting there.
Great, thank you for your answers. I know accessibility is a massive topic in the theatre community right now, so it's great to hear how people are trying to take steps forward to make theatre more accessible. I don't know if Emma and Hannah have anything to add on the topic of accessibility at all.
I guess from my point of view, it may be slightly less from the immersive experiences, but I worked for Pleasance in Edinburgh at the Fringe for a lot of years. And although they're not technically site specific, the Pleasance operates about 24 venues a year, of which only one is a theatre. So a lot of the spaces, although they are usually quite conventional rooms, they are not theatres, and we build them into theatres. So a lot of the accessibility issues are still very applicable. There's limits to how many hearing loops you can have on a site. We were very lucky that we had portable ones, so we could turn any space into a hearing loop space, but we only had 2. So if 2 of them were already out, you couldn't use other ones. And I know even just in the time that I was there, there was so much work putting into making more spaces accessible, not just for the audience members as well, because it's often that it's perhaps thought about first that it's accessible for the audience, not so much that it's also accessible for performers that need an accessible space. And certainly in the last few years that I was there, there were more shows that were coming in with performers with accessibility needs. And it was interesting to sort of think that perhaps the audience were prioritized over the shows. And it was good to see. And I'm sure it's been a couple of years since I worked there, because I left because I had a child, and Edinburgh and small babies less so. But it's good to know that they were working towards accessibility from both directions. So making it more accessible for people to watch and more accessible for performers that needed it.
Great, thank you, Emma. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Hannah.
No, I don't. I agree with everything that's been said so far. I think site-specific and immersive both have a long way to go in terms of accessibility from as Emma says, from both directions, really. And I think that that's a problem that will always need a lot of money thrown at it, unless you know the initial conception is more flexible.
Fabulous, thank you. And as we're nearing time today, I've got one last question, which we might have to keep to like shorter answers. And these are questions around networking and getting into jobs, because of a lot of our audience today are early career stage managers or in training. And as we enter the big wide world, we have a lot of questions about how to get where we want to go. There are a lot of questions around this, and I think the SMNS can do Ask the Team questions and publish these on social media after this session. So the conversation won't end here. But I don't know if anybody can answer about how to get into immersive and site-specific theatre. Like, does anybody have any brief tips on how to get there and to network?
I think a big part of it is being prepared for, being prepared for hard work. That's what we always do in stage management in whatever show. But I think hopefully you've got a flavour that that you have to give that little bit extra. And again, that's something that usually as stage managers we do. You'll be giving even more than that. The rewards are fantastic when you get to travel home with maybe some audience after a secret cinema event, because the stage management get to leave once the performance bit is done, and there's perhaps a party in the bar carrying after. But the chances are you'll be going home with people that don't realise that you're working on that event, and the buzz is brilliant, and you can just see that the amount of enjoyment and the suspension of disbelief with people that when they're in a site-specific or immersive production, they really get lost in a show, and that's something that is just as great a buzz for me, especially as having somebody, you know, a great big sat audience that are cheering and roaring at the curtain call, because you don't often get a curtain call in immersive theatre. So I'd say prepare to give even more of yourself, but the rewards are great, and I think it's showing that you're going to be keen. Recently I've just been doing the sort of being part of the interviews for the Doctor Who event, and the theatre management were quite nervous about having people that hadn't ever done immersive before, and I had to remind them that the first big scale professional immersive that I did was the Passion of Port Talbot, and I, funnily enough, managed to survive that. So if I could do that, then there are opportunities for everybody of experience. Now, you might not have somebody who's recent graduate going into your CSM role, but I'm sure that there is an awful lot of people out there that can very much hold their own in an ASM position, or book cover potentially as well. So I'd say show that you're eager. Don't pretend that you know what it's necessarily about if you haven't done it before, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But just be honest. You know what your skills are, and no matter what somebody else might be trying to say, the skill set is solid across the disciplines. So just make sure that you're confident with yourself, but don't try and kid anyone that you've done everything before, because you've heard from all of us, we've done some crazy things in some really weird places, and we've not done it all, and we won't ever. So
fabulous, thank you, Matt. That was some really great advice. I don't, Natalie, do you have something to add?
Yeah, just adding on to that, that's a really good summation of it. Like, I hadn't done immersive show calling before I did Stranger Things, but I had gone to quite a few cinema and immersive events, and I just made it really clear to everyone that I worked with on a contract basis that I was really interested in giving it a go and trying out. And it was through talking to a sound designer on a show at the Doma that I ended up getting my name down on an interview list with Secret Cinema. He was like, oh, she said she was really keen, and I worked with her on this new musical at the Doma, and here's her experience. And then I got in the room with the directors and producers, and I was able to kind of just be myself and just didn't hide the fact that I was a fan of their work. I'd gone to a few things, and they loved that I had actually experienced what they did and was interested in what the company was doing. So I would hugely say, if there's a place that you want to work at, or if there's a company you want to work for, make sure that you're well versed in the work that they produce, because it's very clear in an interview setting, particularly, that if you don't know your stuff when it comes to what you're talking to the producers about. So I was just very honest with my enthusiasm for it. And it ended up that because I had done a placement on a circus performance that the director had also worked on, there was this common ground, even though I'd never worked in immersive before. So there's a lot of other ways to prove your strengths, and everyone coming out of a graduate program has more training than me. I have an English degree, so I never trained in stage management. So just, yeah, have the confidence that you've got the knowledge and you're more than capable, as Matt says, particularly like to step into a role as an ASM in any of these things, let alone any other position. So have confidence in your ability, and just be very vocal with the people that you work with of what your interests are, because you just don't know who you're talking to and what their other shows are. So yeah, always walk into an environment, I think, knowing that you don't know the skills of the people around you, and you've always got something to learn from them. So yeah.
I was going to add as well, just because I'm always an advocate for the underdog, that it's very much who you know, and don't forget that you can start small. Like, it's so amazing working on the big shows, it really is, but there are so many smaller theatre companies that are so keen to produce interesting work, and partly you never know where they will be in the future, and like Natalie said, you don't know who you're talking to necessarily. It may well be that that job gets you on the next one. And certainly some of the smaller scale companies often have a drive to, you know, do something different as well as the big ones. They maybe don't have the budgets, but, you know, some of the smaller scale immersive or site specific pieces, they're in the most unusual places. They maybe don't have a very long run, but by doing that show, you make contacts for the next one and the next one. And it's definitely, it's not necessarily about jumping straight to the biggest show you can do. And it also, you build your skill set so that when that job comes up on the show that is your dream job, you, like Matt and Natalie have both said, you have the confidence in your skills and ability because you've built them up. You know, it's the big shows are fantastic and they are a goal for a lot of people, but the small stuff isn't, you know, beneath anybody, because you can have so much fun with a tiny cast and a tiny crew on a show that maybe only lasts a week, as you can on a show that lasts for months or years if you're in the West End. So it's definitely, you know, just take all the opportunities you can get and speak to everybody that you can. I think that's the biggest thing. Just talk to everybody, because you never know who they might know and where it might lead you.
Amazing, thank you, Emma. Hannah, I don't know if you've got anything you want to briefly add before we wrap up.
I agree with everything everyone said so far. I'd also add, if you don't get jobs to begin with, don't take it personally and don't be knocked back. I went for the first immersive job I went for was only about 9 years ago, and I've been working professionally for hundreds of years. And it was the first job I'd been for that I hadn't got in a very long time, and it was a zombie chase game across London, involving the Jubilee line, Stratford Shopping Centre, and a few ambulances. And I was interviewed for an ASM job, and I think they were cheating us really, because we ended up stage managing a zombie football match as part of the interview. And I suspect that's why we were there. And I was really disheartened when I didn't get the job, because I thought I'd been a company manager for you know, 10 years now, and I'm clearly not good enough to ASM a zombie football match. And I took it quite personally. So don't take it personally is what I would say, because a few years later, I was asked to company manage The Drowned Man, and that was my first immersive job ever. And I was totally in at the deep end, but you know, like Natalie said, I was just very truthful with them about what I had or hadn't done. And I'd literally seen the show a week beforehand. And that was the first immersive show I'd ever even seen. And I just went to this interview and it had blown my mind. And I was just so excited about the show and the venue and how it worked. And I couldn't even figure out how the show worked. There was 120 rooms and 12 loops, and it just made no sense to me. And I was so excited to find out about it. I think I turned into a bit of a fan, you know, in the interview, but they still gave me the job anyway. So just, you know, be yourself, be truthful to you, be yourself, be excited about theatre. Generally, that's what I'd just say. Just be excited about it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you for all of that advice. It means a lot to hear from people as we exit the great pause. Some really great advice there. Thank you. So before I wrap up with thank yous,